Today, in your speech, you have been speaking of how philosophers could or should actually contribute to cognitive science. And the other way around, do you think that philosophy as such has something to gain from a connection of actual collaboration with cognitive science?
Well, I certainly do, and there are numerous philosophers who are showing what can be gained from that. The way I pursue philosophy is not, however, I think, among them. And this is a regard in which I'm out of step, both with a significant tradition in analytic philosophy, which has always cared about the science of its time, and, as I indicated earlier, with the pragmatist tradition, which followed the Enlightenment in caring a great deal about the science of our time. The sense in which I do care about the science is that is the most sophisticated form of understanding that we have, and it's our job as philosophers to understand that. Science is also the most spectacularly successful social institution of the last 300 years, and I think we need to understand that and how that's connected to its cognitive achievements in understanding. But that's to take science as a target for understanding. It's a very different thing to try and incorporate results in primatology, in developmental psychology, in cognitive psychology more generally, in neurophysiology, and so on, as inputs into our philosophical thinking. And I'm inclined to make a relatively sharp distinction between the philosophical question of what counts as talking or thinking or meaning that things are thus and so, and empirical research into how creatures that are evolved, wired up, embodied, and trained as we are manage to do something like that. That last seems to me a question of considerable intellectual import, but not to be a core philosophical question. I'm distinguishing here between saying what the trick consists in, the trick of thinking something, a philosophical question, and saying how the trick is done, which I think is an empirical question that philosophers as intellectuals can be interested in, but as philosophers have no particular expertise in addressing. And it is that question of what would you have to do to count as thinking or saying or meaning that things are thus and so. That's the question that I'm principally interested in. And if we put that in the form, what do you have to do such that doing that counts as saying, thinking, or meaning something? Then we can begin to see the continuity with the pragmatist tradition.
Now, speaking specifically of philosophy of the language, do you think that philosophy of language still has a future, or is it open to developments in the future, or will it lose ground to cognitive science? In other words, will the development of cognitive science render philosophy of language obsolete?
Well, I don't think so, because language looms so large in cognitive functioning at any of the higher levels, at any of the levels that are most significant for thinking about us. But intellectually, the 20th century was the century of language, not just in analytic philosophy, but absolutely equally in continental philosophy. No one is a more serious philosopher of language than Heidegger, for instance. It's a serious topic for Husserl. The emphasis on genealogy, on ideology in continental philosophy is a focus on the way in which, for instance, power relations can come to be embodied and encoded in systematically distorted structures of communication, to use a phrase that Habermas has used. The entire high culture in its thinking about us, has come to see the significance of language in transforming us from merely sentient into genuinely sapient creatures. So there's no question that language is going to continue to be a central focus in cognitive science. And I believe that philosophers of language bring particular conceptual resources to bear on thinking about language. And one of the reasons we do is because our tradition more or less begins with the logical revolution, the revolution ultimately in semantics that Frege initiated, which gave us our first algebraic grip on notions of meaning. And I think we're in a position there, like the position the physicists were in as Galileo and then Descartes began to assemble the conceptual tools that would get us a mathematical grip on the motions of middle-sized objects in space.
My last question is to look to the future, because during this present workshop, your views and your theories have been commented upon, expanded upon, but also somewhat challenged. So the question is, what are, according to you, the main problems or challenges, really, that your philosophy may have to face?
At the center of my views is an approach to semantics from the side of inference, by contrast to the traditional approach on the side of representation. It takes as one of its fundamental categories the notion of expression, but read in a conceptual way rather than in a way that's related to emotions, gestures, and so on, which the expressivist tradition typically had. That sort of rationalist, inferentialist expressivism, I think, was originated by Hegel. That's one of the reasons that I'm interested in him. But it's absolutely critical that we be able to get the sort of algebraic control over conceptual roles that we have seen tantalizing progress in the second wave of the modal revolution. I think the first wave of the modal revolution was Kripke's provision of sound and complete semantics for modal logical vocabulary, but that the most important, philosophically important feature of the modal revolution was the second wave, when people like David Lewis, Stalnaker, Kaplan, Montague showed how the apparatus of possible worlds, the kind of model theory that Kripke had come up with, extension of Tarski model theory to the modal logical case, could be deployed to provide an intentional semantics for non-logical expressions quite generally. The third phase of the modal revolution was Kripke's discussion of metaphysical modalities, his separation of necessity from a priority and so on, and naming a necessity. I actually think that the philosophical action was in the second wave. It's a challenge for us to extend that progress to a fuller and more flexible way of mathematically representing the meanings of both ordinary non-logical expressions and eventually the sort of philosophically important concepts like personal identity, concepts like justice, and so on, that philosophers have properly concerned themselves with. And it seems to me that it's very early days in doing that. On the semantic inferentialist line, the contents of non-logical concepts, as well as logical concepts, are articulated by the role they play in massively multi-premise, non-monotonic material inferential relations. And we don't now have a good mathematical representation of such relations and the roles that expressions can play in them. So I think the immediate challenge for a semantic inferentialist is to see how we can